In this screencast, we're going to continue using RSpec to write the specs for the movies controller. And before we proceed, I want to show you that I've edited the .rspec file, which is in the application's root directory. These are the default options RSpec will use if we don't override them on the command line. So the options I like are -C for colored messages and -FD for messages in the documentation style where you actually see the name of each example as it runs. And actually, if you type RSpec-H, you'll get a list of all of the other options that you could specify. So with that in mind, here's the spec that we're going to try to run. It's going to try to post, in other words, simulate the user submitting a form to the search TMDB action of movies controller, and it's going to try to pass this hash as the value of the params. Now, what's going to happen when we try to run this example, and I will initially run it manually rather than launching right into Autotest, and I'll show you why that happens in a moment. So why is this example going to fail? Well, remember that anytime we're going to add a new controller action to our application, one of the things we have to add is a route. And sure enough, in this case, we haven't yet added any route that would match post search TMDB. So let's go ahead and add that route. I've got the routes.rb file over here. Now we've been using resourceful routes, but the routing documentation tells us that we can actually do routes that are as simple as this. So this will match the exact URL, and by convention over configuration, it'll get routed to the movies controller and the search TMDB action. So let's go ahead and save that file, and now I'll start Autotest. And the reason I didn't start Autotest previously is because of a quirk in the way it works. The config directory is not actually monitored. So because the only change we made here is to a file in the config directory, Autotest wouldn't have picked that up. So with Autotest running, we still see that our test fails, but now the failure reason is different and it's more in line with what we expected. The action search TMDB could not be found for movies controller. So the route worked. It was trying to find the search TMDB method, but we don't have any such method. So this is exactly what's supposed to happen. The test is failing, and it's going to drive us to create that code. So let's switch over to the movies controller. And for now, let's just add an empty method. We're going to add the least amount of code possible to try to get that test going towards green. So we're going to add an empty action. And let's see what happens when Autotest picks up that change. Now remember that by convention over configuration, even though there's no code in our method, Rails will try to render a view called search TMDB as soon as the action finishes executing. And right on cue, here's the problem: action view missing template. So the controller action was successfully executed, but then Rails ran into trouble because there was no template called search TMDB that it could render. So our last step is going to be to create the simplest possible template that will pass the test. And in my book, that means creating an empty file. So we will just go touch app views movies search TMDB html.haml. So this will create an empty file that's in the right place. And remember, empty is legal. It's a boring view, but it's syntactically valid. And now you can see that our first spec has gone green. We've still got our other two examples, which we haven't written any code for yet. Now, as the book explains, it's a little misleading that this spec is green, because in fact, the spec hasn't actually tried to test anything. In other words, it's done the form posting, and we have just enough for that to succeed, but we haven't made any assertions about what should happen after the form is posted. That's going to be the subject of our next couple of tasks. So to recap, I added a few things to the RSpec.rspec file, the default options that RSpec is going to use. I added a route to the routes file so that we could match our new controller action. And I added a new controller action that doesn't do anything yet, but is enough to get us to the point where we can start the red-green refactor cycle.